Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. Tattoos fascinate me because they take something invisible and they actually make it permanent. Identity, if you think about it, is usually a moving thing. It shifts with time, with experience, with people we meet, and the lives that we live. But a tattoo interrupts that movement. It kind of fixes a moment, a belief, a memory onto the skin and says, quietly but unmistakably, this matters. And in a world where almost everything can be edited and deleted or rebranded, that kind of permanence has weight, real weight. There's also something deeply intimate about tattoos. Most art exists at a distance. It hangs on walls, it sits in books, it's placed behind glass. You have to step forward to take a look at it, and then you step away. But a tattoo actually lives on the body. It moves as you move. It ages as you age. It softens, it blurs, and it changes with time. And it's not simply seen, it's carried. Less like looking at art, more like encountering a life that's being lived in real time. And then there is the part people rarely say out loud. The fact that tattoos involve pain. Not dramatic, sometimes unbearable, but not enough to matter. And I think that changes everything. It turns decoration into something closer to ritual. And across centuries and cultures, sailors, warriors, pilgrims, modern city dwellers, that small ordeal gives the mark its gravity. It feels earned in a way. And because it's earned, it actually feels more significant. Tattoos also pull us in because there are stories within the art. You see a symbol, a date, a name, a sleeve of intricate patterns, and immediately your mind begins to work. What does it mean? What happened? Who were they thinking of? Why did they do it? Even when the story is never told, the suggestion of one is enough. We're wired for narrative. We all are. And tattoos hint at sudden chapters written just beneath the surface that we try to understand. I think there is also a quiet tension in tattoos that gives them their edge. At different moments in history, they've been marks of honor and marks of punishment, symbols of belonging and signs of exclusion. And that contradiction has never really gone away. To mark your body is, in one sense, to actually take control of it, but it can also feel like stepping outside what's expected. That tension, the subtle defiance, still hums, beneath the surface. And perhaps beneath all of this, there's something more unsettling. Tattoos actually force us to confront a very simple idea, that we're temporary, and yet we choose to inscribe permanence onto ourselves. The body will fade, it's going to change, it will eventually disappear, but for a time it carries something fixed, something chosen. That tension between what lasts and what doesn't is endlessly compelling, I have to tell you. It's not really about ink at all. It's about the human desire to leave a mark, if only for a while. I was thinking about all of this as I finished reading Painted People, Humanity in 21 Tattoos by Dr. Matt Lodder. On the surface, it's a history of tattooing, but I think that undersells the actual book. What Lodder does is something far more interesting. He takes individual tattoos, real tattoos, from different points in history, and he uses them as entry points into much larger stories. Stories of power, stories of punishment, belief, identity. From the punishment tattoos of ancient China to the quietly adopted markings of Victorian aristocrats, even a future king, Lodder actually shows that tattooing has never belonged to one particular group or to one particular moment. It actually moves across time, across class, and across culture. And I think crucially, he pushes us to see tattooing not as something marginal or merely decorative, but as a serious artistic practice. Not just something for criminologists or sociologists to explain away, but something that deserves to be looked at in the same way that we look at painting or sculpture or any other form of creative expression. And I think what sits at the heart of all this is a rather bold idea, one that historians have been making for generations, that we can understand people and places in the past by looking at the objects that they leave behind. Walk through a palace or a country house, stand in a gallery, handle a piece of pottery or a fragment of metalwork, and in a sense, you're actually reading history through a material thing. These objects carry intention and meaning, and from them we build entire narratives about how people lived, what they valued, and how they understood their world. So if my claim holds, and it is a big claim, then it can't stop at the walls of museums or the contents of archaeological sites. It has to apply to something far more intimate, something that doesn't sit on a pedestal or behind glass, but is worn, lived in, and carried through time on the human body itself. Tattoos, once you begin to look at them properly, belong in exactly the same category. They're not simply personal decorations or private expressions, they're images shaped by individual lives. Let that sit for a moment. Created at specific moments in particular places and tied to the histories of those places in a way that can be surprisingly revealing. Once you start treating tattoos as historical artifacts in their own right, something shifts quite dramatically. They stop being curiosities and begin to function as entry points into much larger stories. Through them, you find yourself moving into areas that you wouldn't expect, into questions of copyright law, into the economics of the beef trade during the Cold War, into the workings of the ancient Persian postal system, also into the care of children in the early 20th century, and even into the limits of archaeology as a method, if you like, of understanding the past. All of these threads can be anchored quite unexpectedly, I think, in marks made on the skin, which is precisely why tattoos, despite often being dismissed as narrow or purely personal, can open up narratives that are far broader and more complex than they first appear. There is, however, I think, an obvious and rather uncomfortable problem at the center of this, which is the skin doesn't last. There is a line that captures it perfectly, that tattooing is, in a way, mayfly art. It's something that endures only for the span of a human life and then disappears within months of burial. For something we think of as permanent, tattoos are in fact remarkably fragile, and most of them vanish almost entirely from historical record. What survives does so largely by accident, through unusual conditions of preservation, such as freezing or mummification. And even then, the number of examples we have is extraordinarily small, perhaps only a few dozen bodies across thousands of years and multiple continents. And yet, I think those few examples are enough to give us glimpses into the past that would otherwise be completely inaccessible. From South America to Egypt, from Europe to Siberia, these preserved bodies allow us to see not just that tattooing existed, but how it may have functioned within different cultures. And among them, one figure stands out for me above all the others, the man that we now know as Ötzi the Iceman, who, for the moment at least, remains the oldest known tattooed human ever discovered. Ötzi lived more than 5,000 years ago in what we would describe as the Copper Age, and he died very violently in the Alps, shot in the back with an arrow, and left where he fell. His body was then preserved by ice, and it was only revealed in the late 20th century as the glaciers began to recede. And what we find in him, I think, is both extraordinary and frustrating in equal measure. He's absolutely covered in tattoos, but they're not elaborate or decorative in any obvious sense, consisting instead of very small lines and crosses and grouped marks placed at particular points on his body. And I think what makes them really compelling is not their actual appearance, but their placement. These marks seem to correspond to areas where he suffered either from strain or degeneration or pain, particularly around the joints and along the lower back, which raises the possibility that they're not intended as decoration at all, but actually as some kind of intervention. They may have been medical, or perhaps something closer to what we might call medico-magical, where the art of tattooing itself, the puncturing of the skin, the stimulation of the body, even the release of endorphins was believed to have therapeutic effect, or where the marks were intended to invoke healing or protection. The truth is that we don't know, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the case so powerful. Ötzi gives us an individual in remarkable detail. We actually know what he ate, how he dressed, how his tools were made, and of course how he died. But we don't have a broader cultural framework that actually allows us to interpret his tattoos with any real confidence. And I think he stands in many ways alone as a single data point from a world that has largely disappeared. And so we're left to infer, to speculate, and to build possibilities rather than absolute certainties. And yet, even in that uncertainty, the significance is abundantly clear. A handful of marks on a body preserved in ice become a way of thinking about medicine, belief, pain, and the human desire to act upon the body itself. What begins as something small and easily overlooked expands outwards into much larger questions, which is precisely why tattoos, when they're taken seriously, have the capacity to lead us far beyond the limit we might initially place on them. So if I now move from the frozen Alps down to the heat of Egypt, the story becomes, if anything, even more intriguing, because here we're not dealing with carefully prepared royal mummies wrapped for eternity, but with something far more accidental. These are individuals from pre-dynastic Egypt who died in the desert long before formal mummification became a practice, whose bodies were preserved simply because the sand and the heat desiccated them quickly enough to halt decay. There's no intention here, no ritual preservation, just chance. And yet it's precisely that chance that gives us some of the most revealing evidence of early tattooing. What's remarkable is that many of these tattoos are not immediately visible. For decades, in some cases over a century, these bodies have sat in museum collections, catalogued and studied, and yet their tattoos went unnoticed. And of course, it's only now with modern-day imaging techniques, ultraviolet light, infrared scanning, and all the wizardry of contemporary archaeology that these markings are now beginning to emerge. And they're emerging regularly, almost unsettlingly so, as if the past is slowly revealing details it had kept hidden in plain sight. When they do appear, however, they're striking. Not random marks, not crude scratches, but deliberate images of bulls and sheep and geometric designs that echo patterns found elsewhere in the material culture of that time. You see the same visual language appearing on pottery, on ceramics, on decorative objects. And what's really interesting, I think, is that suddenly a connection becomes clear. Tattooing wasn't an isolated act. It was actually part of a broader visual world, a shared set of symbols, if you like, and motifs that people lived among and then chose quite literally to inscribe onto themselves. And that makes it feel, in a really strange way, kind of very modern. Today people tattoo the images they see around them, images from social media, art, from the visual noise of contemporary life. In pre-dynastic Egypt, some 3,500 years before Christ, the process seems to have been much the same. Different imagery, of course, different context, but the same impulse to take what surrounds you and actually make it part of your body. How were these tattoos actually made? And here again, the answer is both, I think, simple and very revealing. The evidence in Loder's book suggests that many of them were created through deep incision. Skin opened with a sharpened tool, perhaps flint, perhaps obsidian, and then a pigment introduced into the wound. Soot from a fire, carbon black, something as basic as the residue from an oil lamp, rubbed into the cut so that as the skin healed, the mark remained. In other parts of the world, plant-based pigments were used, but the principle is exactly the same. All you really need to create a tattoo is to break the skin, add a substance that will actually stain it. There's something almost humbling in that simplicity, isn't there? Because it suggests that tattooing is not a complex invention that requires a particular, moment of technological breakthrough, but something that actually could emerge almost anywhere at any time. The tools, of course, vary. The techniques shift slightly depending on the time and the place, but the underlying method has changed very little in 4,000 years. Even today, for all the sophistication of modern machines, the principle remains exactly the same. And I think what's particularly fascinating is the way archaeologists are now beginning to identify the tools themselves. Objects once thought to be sewing needles or implements for leather work are now being re-examined under microscopes. Their surfaces analyzed for wear patterns and traces of pigment. And in some cases, those tiny details, they actually reveal a very different story, that these were not tools for cloth or hide, but actually for human skin. That they were used to make marks that have long since vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of their existence. And that changes the narrative. For a long time, there was a tendency, particularly among early 20th century scholars, to treat tattooing as something strange, something that must have originated in one place and then spread outward, as though it required a single moment of invention. But I think the more convincing explanation is far simpler, and in many ways far more human. Tattooing may not have needed to be invented at all. It may have been discovered. A spark from a fire, a shard of hot material embedding itself in the skin, a wound that heals with pigment trapped beneath it, and suddenly that possibility reveals itself. From there, it's not a great leap to intention, to repetition, and of course to design. And once that step's taken, once the idea takes hold that the body can actually be marked in that way, then everything follows. And I think what we're looking at across Egypt and across the Alps, across the Americas, isn't the spread of a single idea from a single source, but the repeated rediscovery of something inherent, a simple act, a mark in the skin that then opens the door to meaning, identity, and of course, expression. And once that door is opened, it never really closes. What seems far more plausible once you step back from it is that tattooing doesn't begin in one place and spread neatly across the world, but emerges instead again and again in different cultures at different times across deep history. Not once, but many, many times over. If the basic ingredients are so simple, a sharp object, a wound, a pigment, then the idea itself is almost inevitable. And you can imagine it appearing 40, perhaps even 50,000 years ago, long before anything we would recognize as recorded history, quietly rediscovered whenever human beings lived close to fire, to tools, and to their own curiosity about the body. And yet, despite that immense antiquity, despite the fact that tattooing is as old as human civilization itself, the questions have never really gone away. Even now, people still react in very familiar ways. Why would you do that to yourself? It's permanent. You're going to regret it. The language feels modern, but I think in truth it carries echoes of something much older, something that has been building for centuries. And to understand that, you have to move into the world of European thought, because much of the suspicion surrounding tattoos is actually rooted there. The ancient Greeks and Romans, those great architects of Western intellectual tradition, didn't practice tattooing in any widespread or celebrated way, within their own societies, that is. They knew of it, absolutely, because they encountered it in the cultures that they conquered. And they used it themselves in more marginal contexts, to mark slaves, to mark criminals or outsiders. From very early on, tattooing becomes associated not with the center of society, but with its edges. And that distinction matters because once something is seen as belonging to other people, it carries to meaning beyond the act itself. Tattooing becomes a marker, a way of separating one group from another. If you like, a visible line drawn across the body. But by the time you move into the early modern period in Europe, that idea is actually hardened into something much more troubling. The belief that tattooing is something primitive, something done by those considered less civilized, while Europeans in this narrative have supposedly moved beyond it. When Europeans encountered the Americas at the end of the 15th century, there is, I think, increasingly a brief movement where the story could have gone either way. Early accounts note tattooed bodies, and rather than recoil, some observers recognize something familiar. They recall references from classical texts, from their own histories, and there's a flicker of a connection, a sense that people are not so different after all. And this is hugely important. And tattooing in that moment becomes a bridge. But it doesn't last. As exploration turns into empire, as the 18th century gives way to the great age of sail and expansion into the Pacific, that bridge collapses. Tattooing is reinterpreted, recast as something fundamentally alien, something that separates rather than connects. And by the 19th century, a powerful myth has actually taken hold that Europeans never truly practiced tattooing, or that if they did, it was so distant as to be irrelevant. And I think the narrative then becomes one of distance and superiority, and tattooing is actually pushed firmly into the category of other. From there, the arguments begin to sound familiar. Tattooing is primitive, it's barbaric, it's a defacement of the body, something unnatural, something that interferes with what is often described as God-given form. The performance becomes a problem, the pain becomes a warning, and I think the act itself is loaded with moral weight. And the remarkable thing is how persistent those ideas have been over the centuries. Because even today, stripped of their colonial language and softened by modern sensibilities, the same concerns still surface. The unease about permanence, the discomfort with altering the body, the quiet suspicion that something is being crossed. These aren't new reactions. They're the latest expression of a much older way of thinking, one that has been shaped over centuries by culture, power, and the stories societies choose to tell themselves and others. Which brings me back in a rather satisfying way to kind of where I started. Tattoos are ancient. They are widespread. They have emerged independently across the world again and again. And yet the meaning we attach to them, the fascination, the suspicion, the questions, they're not just about the act itself. They're about history, about identity, and about the long shadow of how we have chosen to understand the difference between ourselves and everyone else. One of the most revealing ways into all of this is not through history, actually, but through story. Because once you begin to trace individual lives, I think the abstract ideas about tattooing, crime, class, and identity suddenly take on weight. In the book, there's a case from London in the 1840s. Two women, Jane and Mary, petty thieves who rob a drunk man. Hardly the stuff of grand history. And yet, through their story, you begin to see how tattooing and criminality becomes entangled in the Western imagination. It's not that tattoos inherently single deviants, but that they become associated with those already pushed to the margins. And over time, that association hardens into assumption. The mark on the body becomes evidence, or at least is treated as such, and the person wearing it is quietly placed into a category. That connection proves remarkably difficult to shake. Even as historians push back, even as broader histories of tattooing emerge, there remains a persistent strand of thinking, particularly in the West, that links tattoos with criminality, with outsiders, and those who don't quite belong. And it's a story told so often that it begins to feel natural, even though it's anything but. And yet, at the very same moment, that tattoos are actually being coded as marks of deviance, something rather extraordinary is happening at the opposite end of society. Because the only reason we have a modern tattoo industry in the West at all, quite bluntly, is because of aristocratic patronage. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autodomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autodomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Before the mid-19th century, tattooing certainly exists, even among the elites, but it tends to be informal, almost private. You're tattooed by a friend, by a colleague, by someone within your circle. And it's not yet commercial practice in any structured sense. That begins to change in the 1850s, and the turning point isn't in London or Paris, but Japan. When Japan opens to the West in the mid-19th century, it unleashes a wave of fascination. Everything Japanese becomes fashionable. Art, design, textiles, aesthetics, and tattooing is actually part of that cultural surge. Suddenly, tattoos are not just marks. They're actually seen as art. They're intricate, sophisticated, visually striking, and that shift matters. Into that world steps royalty. Edward VII, long before he becomes king, travels to the Holy Land, and I guess, like many pilgrims before him, he's actually tattooed in Jerusalem. This really isn't unusual in itself. Christian pilgrims have been marking their journeys in this way for centuries. But when a future king does it, the meaning of it changes. It becomes visible and it becomes aspirational. His sons then follow. Prince Albert Victor, and more significantly, the future George V, are tattooed during their travels, including when they visit Japan. George writes home almost casually that he has just been tattooed like his father. And that small detail ripples outward through society. Because in the 19th century, people watch royalty very closely. They watch what they wear, where they go, what they do, and all of it sets a tone. And suddenly tattoos begin to appear in places you might not expect, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, in the clubs of St. James, in the elite circles of London and New York. Wealthy men commission Japanese-style designs, elaborate scenes, hunting imagery, even reproductions of fine art. And suddenly what had been marginal becomes fashionable and even desirable. And that, crucially, is the moment when tattooing becomes a profession. For the first time, it becomes possible for someone to charge for this work, to build a living around it, to move it from informal exchange to commercial practice. The modern tattoo industry, in that sense, owes as much to royal curiosity and aristocratic fashion as it does to sailors or soldiers or any of the other groups that we tended to associate it with. Which actually leaves us with a rather striking contradiction. On one hand, tattoos are linked to criminals, to punishment, to the margins of society. In places like China, for instance, tattooing could be imposed as a penalty, a visible mark of wrongdoing placed deliberately where it couldn't be hidden. On the other hand, the same act, the same process of marking the skin, is being embraced by kings and princes and the social elite, transformed into something incredibly fashionable, even refined. And the tension never quite resolves. It's there in the 19th century, and it's still there now. shaping the way that we think about tattoos, often without us even realizing it. The same mark can actually signal rebellion or status, deviance or belonging, depending entirely on who is wearing it and who is doing the looking. Which brings me quite naturally to the question of fashion itself. Because just as today we see reoccurring motifs, stars, butterflies, familiar symbols that move through popular culture, the past had its own trends, its own visual languages, and its own moments where I think certain styles dominated. And if you follow those threads, you begin to see tattooing not as something static, but as something constantly evolving, responding to taste, to influence, and to the shifting currents of the societies that actually produce it. I think what becomes clear as you follow these threads forward is that tattooing has always been in conversation with the wider visual world. The same designs that appear in Japanese prints, on ceramics, on furniture, begin to surface on skin, carried there by their artists who are responding to exactly the same influences. And by the 20th century, that process becomes even more obvious. In the 1940s, people are walking around with, Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse, inked onto their bodies. Or even portraits of actors like Gary Cooper. The visual image of cinema and popular culture quite literally embedded into the skin. And I don't think that pattern has ever really stopped. By the 1990s and into the present day, people are still doing the same thing, copying designs they see on celebrities, lifting imagery from the world around them, and translating fashion back into permanence. What's striking, I think, is just how early that crossover begins. As far back as 1929, the French designer Elsa Schiaparelli is producing tattooed-themed knitwear, garments designed to mimic the look of tattooed skin, sometimes in flesh-toned fabrics that give the impression at a glance that the wearer is actually marked beneath the surface. And it's a really curious reversal. Tattooing doesn't simply step into fashion. Fashion begins to imitate tattooing, its visual language and playing with its meaning. But here's the thing, if tattooing can signal style and identity and belonging, it has, for much of its history, served as a far harsher purpose. Because one of the reasons tattoos are so powerful is that they are difficult to remove, right? They don't wash away, they endure. And that makes them an extraordinarily effective tool for marking people out, for fixing identity into the body in a way that can't easily be escaped. The very word stigma comes from this idea, from the ancient Greek practice of marking the skin to signify status, often negative status. A visible sign, if you like, that someone has actually crossed the line. And across different cultures, that principle appears again and again. In ancient Greece and Rome, tattooing is used to mark the slaves, as I mentioned, to mark criminals or outsiders, effectively turning the body into a record of transgression. In ancient China, punishment tattooing became formalized, applied for a range of offenses, from theft to adultery, sometimes repeated offenses leading to marks placed prominently on the face, ensuring that the individual carries their crime with them wherever they go. Punishment tattoos are used not just to identify the offenders, but to dehumanize them and control how they act in society. The 20th century offers some of the starkest examples, with prisoners in Nazi concentration camps forcibly tattooed with numbers, their identities reduced to a sequence of digits. And during conflicts such as the Korean War, prisoners were marked with political slogans that were done to them because it turned their body into a site of humiliation and coercion. And that actually brings me to one of my favorite authors and books, The Garden of the Evening Mists by Tan Tuan Eng. And it's incredibly powerful because it's rooted in something very real. In the past, there were collectors, even doctors who preserved tattooed skin after death. And most famously, Dr. Fukushi Masaichi, who saw these bodies not as human remains, but as artworks worth saving. And his logic was very simple, if not slightly unsettling. Tattoos die with the body. So if the artist is great enough, the skin itself becomes something to preserve. And that is exactly the tension Tan Tuan Eng draws on in Garden of the Evening Mists. In that novel, the collector's interest in the protagonist's skin isn't just macabre, it's actually revealing. The main character has actually been tattooed by a master. And so in Tan Tuan Eng's eyes, she becomes less a person and more a rare object, something that can be owned once her life is over. And that's what makes the book so compelling, and I have to say also so disturbing, because tattoos are not separate from the person. They are memory, trauma, identity, lived experience onto the body. And to remove them, to preserve them, is to strip them of the very thing that actually gives them meaning. What was once alive suddenly becomes static. What was personal becomes collectible. And so the question lingers quietly but uncomfortably. If a tattoo only exists as part of a living body, what exactly are you preserving when you take it away? And that perhaps I think is the thread that runs through all this. Tattooing is never just one thing. It can be an act of self-expression, a marker of fashion, a sign of belonging, but it can also be a tool of control, a way of fixing identity onto the body without consent. The same process, the same basic art of marking the skin can carry entirely different meaning depending on who holds the power. Which is why I think the fascination never fades. Because when you look at a tattoo, you're not looking at an image. You're actually looking at a history, sometimes chosen, sometimes imposed, always embedded in the body and always telling a story that runs deeper than the surface. I think what becomes particularly revealing once you start digging into the history is how uneven the story of tattooing is when it comes to gender. In the Western world, at least, there's been this assumption, I suppose, that tattooing belongs to men, to sailors, to soldiers, to laborers, men who work with their hands, men who actually endure pain, men who, I suppose, live on the edges. And for well over a century, you see this idea repeated again and again, almost ritualistically, in newspapers and commentaries. Every generation seems to rediscover the same supposed shock that tattooing is no longer just for sailors. And I think woven into that is something else, something sharper, a kind of astonishment, sometimes even outrage that women might be doing it too. And of course, you find these wonderful, slightly absurd moments in the historical record. In the 1950s, as an example, a columnist in the Daily Mail newspaper, writing under the name Miss Humber, expresses horror at the idea of women being tattooed, as though this was a sign of some great social collapse. And then almost immediately you get the reply. Young women writing in to say quite plainly, we're not drunken sailors. We are choosing elegant designs placed deliberately on the shoulder to be revealed when we wear an evening dress. And there is something almost theatrical about it, this back and forth between scandal and self-possession. And of course, those newspaper stories serve another purpose. They allow, quite conveniently, the publication of images of women in less clothing than would otherwise be acceptable at the time. And of course, shock in that sense becomes a kind of loophole, doesn't it? But I think what's important is that this reaction isn't universal. It's culturally specific. In many parts of the world, tattooing hasn't been male-coded at all. If you look at the Arctic communities, for example, traditional tattooing among Inuit cultures is largely a female practice, embedded in rites of passage, identity, and belonging. In parts of the Pacific, too, the balance shifts. In some societies, tattooing is primarily done just by the women. In others, by men. But the key point is there is nothing inherently masculine about the art itself. That masculinity that I'm talking about in the Western context is actually constructed. And I think when you come down to it, it's tied to ideas of endurance, of pain, of toughness, of the body, if you like, as something to be tested or marked through experience. And once that association's made, it becomes difficult to dislodge. Tattoos come to signal aggression or defiance, or kind of physical resilience, if you like. And they're all qualities that historically have been coded as male, which is why figures who disrupt that pattern become so fascinating. Take Joe Carstairs, for example, born Marion Carstairs, one of the wealthiest women in the world in the early 20th century. She was heir to the Standard Oil fortune, and someone who seemed determined to defy almost every expectation placed on her. She actually called herself Joe. She dressed as a man. She raced powerboats at extraordinary speed. She maintained her own private armed guard. And she lived a life with a kind of unapologetic flamboyance that was decades and decades ahead of her time. She was also incredibly heavily tattooed, and her tattoos were very much a part of that identity. Bold, they were sailor-style designs that aligned her with a masculine coded world, even as she moved fluidly across the boundaries of gender and expectation. And there were even a pair of German sociologists who actually proposed an idea that, while I think it's flawed in its assumptions, it's still useful to think with. They suggested that tattooing tends to follow power. In societies where men dominate, tattooing becomes associated with men. In societies where women hold greater cultural authority, tattooing actually shifts accordingly. In other words, the gender of tattooing isn't inherent, it's contingent. And I think they went even further, somewhat provocatively so, arguing that in modern Western society, women had other ongoing ways of shaping and presenting their appearance. Fashion, cosmetics, the daily work of self-preservation. Whereas tattooing, being permanent, was a more efficient, one-time act of decoration. It's a slightly awkward argument, I have to say, but it points towards something real, that tattooing exists within a broader system of how societies think about bodies, about visibility, and of course about control. And that, perhaps, is the key. Tattooing is never just about the mark itself. It's about who is allowed to mark their body, how that act is interpreted, and what it's actually taken to mean. When women are tattooed in culture, that codes tattooing as masculine. It becomes provocative, disruptive, even scandalous. In other contexts, it's simply normal, expected, even essential, which is why the reactions tell us as much as their tattoos themselves. Because what people are really responding to isn't the ink, but the shifting boundaries of identity, of gender, and of who gets to decide what a body is actually allowed to be. And I think what emerges from all of this, if you follow the thread carefully, is that tattooing doesn't just sit inside history. It actively reveals how power, identity, and culture are constructed. In the modern Western world, in particular, tattooing has come to encode a very specific idea of dominance, one tied very closely to masculinity. That association runs deep enough that even in contemporary discussions around gender, you can actually see it playing out. Tattooing is sometimes used consciously, especially by trans men, to emphasize or engage with culturally recognized markers of masculinity. While I think historically there are accounts of trans women struggling with tattoos precisely because those marks were read so strongly as male-coded that they interfered with how femininity could actually be perceived. And I think that actually tells you something really important. The meaning of a tattoo is never fixed. It's shaped not just by the person who carries it, but by the society that reads it. At the same time, there's long been a parallel effort to position tattooing within the world of art, though not always in the way that I think we might expect. Tattooists themselves have been calling what they do as art for well over a century. And figures like Sutherland MacDonald, working in London in the late 19th century, popularizing the term tattooist as a way of elevating the practice beyond something merely mechanical or utilitarian. But I think what's striking is that this recognition doesn't come from a single moment of acceptance. It emerges gradually, unevenly, through exhibitions, through lectures, through artists themselves insisting on the seriousness of their work. And by the mid-20th century, tattooing is already appearing in gallery contexts, discussed, displayed, even taught about, yet still somehow sitting just outside the boundaries of what's comfortably accepted. Yes, it's recognized, but it's not fully absorbed. And I think even today that tension remains. Part of the reason lies in visibility. For much of modern Western history, most tattoos were hidden. Of course, they existed, but they were never seen. The tattoos that shaped public perception were the visible ones, on sailors, on laborers, on performers, and on those whose bodies were already on display in some way, shape, or form. That creates a distorted picture because it suggests that tattooing belongs only to those particular groups, when in reality it was actually far more widespread, simply concealed beneath clothing, beneath social convention, beneath the quiet decision not to actually show it. Even the early academic study of tattoos reflects that bias. Criminologists, for example, studied tattooing in prisons, not because that was where tattooing existed exclusively, but because those were the bodies available to them. And from that limited sample, broader conclusions were drawn, reinforcing the association between tattoos and criminality. It's a classic case, don't you think, of seeing only what is visible and mistaking it for the whole. And I think what's fascinating is that even now, while tattooing is more visible than it has ever been, when it cuts across class, profession, and identity, there remains a persistent sense that it doesn't quite belong. It never fully settles. It never really becomes entirely ordinary. You see it in the language that keeps resurfacing generation after generation. The same astonishment, the same tone of discovery. You will never guess, who is getting tattooed now. It appears in newspaper columns, in social commentary, in casual conversation. A line from the 1920s, I think, captures it perfectly. That tattooing has actually passed from the savage to the sailor, from the sailor to the landsman, and now sits beneath many a tailored shirt. And yet, even as it moves into the center of society, it retains a sense of strangeness. And I think that's actually the point, because tattooing asks something of us that runs slightly against the grain of modern Western life. It actually asks us to accept permanence in a culture that values incredible flexibility. It actually asks us to embrace pain in a culture that avoids it. It asks us to alter the body in a way that can't easily be undone, to mark time onto something that we know will actually change. All of those things sit just slightly outside what feels comfortable, doesn't it? Which is why, despite its long history, despite its widespread presence, despite its moments of fashion and even endorsement by kings, tattooing never quite becomes ordinary. It remains, I think, in some quiet, persistent way, a little bit strange. And that is precisely that strangeness, I think, is what keeps drawing people in. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for your time, folks. Bye for now.